This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon. Nothing says lovin' like something from the oven. When Jerry Laybourne took over as president of Nickelodeon in 1984, a number of dramatic changes were made in hopes to solidify its audience. A complete visual rebranding, the introduction of animation to the lineup, and new hip dynamic shows like Nick Rocks and Out of Control all played a part in rehabilitating Nickelodeon's reputation as a not-fun green vegetable educational channel. But one show that doesn't get enough credit for turning things around is Lassie, a black and white boy and his dog show from the 1950s. It's not that the adventures of Lassie and her little boy Timmy were exceptional television, but it was television that people born in the late 40s to the early 60s, aka the baby boomer generation, grew up with. This is important because while Nickelodeon was always conceived as the first cable network for kids, kids weren't the ones buying Warner Amex's or Viacom's cable programming. These new baby boomer parents were. When letters from parents started pouring into the Nickelodeon offices, letting the company know how much they appreciated seeing a show from their own childhood on the channel, Laybourne realized that appealing to boomer nostalgia had great potential in hooking new cable subscribers. So in 1985, Laybourne and Nickelodeon began focusing on a huge new project, Nick at Night. We'll get into Nick at Night in great detail in a few episodes, but during its development, it was decided that there should be a show that aired both on Nick at Night and as part of Nickelodeon's daytime programming, a cross-pollination of sorts. Oh, hi parents, I see you've caught your kids watching this old show from the 50s. If you'd like to watch it yourself, we're also airing it at this later hour, along with a bunch of other shows you grew up with. All that was left was to pick a show that would work as both a fun program for kids of the 80s and nostalgia bait for kids of the 50s. And considering the limited selection Nickelodeon had that first year, there was really only one choice. On July 1st, 1985, the same day Nick at Night premiered, Dennis the Menace became part of the Nickelodeon family.
Nickelodeon presents tips from Dennis. The first tip, how to escape a sticky situation.
We have to hurry home for dinner.
Tip number 2, how to get a free snack.
Every time I play my horn, somebody gives me something to put in my mouth.
And tip number 3, how to be a menace in your own home.
If at first you don't succeed, try again.
Any tips for grown-ups, Dennis?
Remember, big people don't cry.
Listen to Dennis. If you've got problems,
I'll solve them for you.
Dennis the Menace on Nickelodeon.
Originally premiering in 1959, Dennis the Menace is a 4-season family sitcom about the Mitchells, working father Henry, stay-at-home mother Alice, and their son, Dennis, a bundle of energy and chaos who is constantly misunderstanding the situation and making things so much worse when he tries to help.
Don't be scared, Mom. It's not alive.
Where did you get that?
In somebody's trash box. I figured we could put it up in the dining room.
Oh, Dennis!
I bet you never thought you'd have one of these, did you?
No.
Would you rather put it up in your bedroom?
While this is a challenge for his parents, Dennis is truly a nightmare for his next-door neighbor, retiree George Wilson, who wants nothing more than to garden, birdwatch, and collect rare coins in peace. Alas, Dennis has no concept of personal boundaries.
Hey, Mr. Wilson, give me your fly swatter.
What?
Give me the fly swatter.
Pete's sake.
He was right on that spot where you spilled the lemonade with all the sugar in it.
I don't care where he was. Never hit him when they're on me.
Never?
No, never.
Okay, Mr. Wilson. I'll just stand here and wave at him.
Sometimes Dennis is joined on little destructive adventures with his best friend Tommy, while avoiding having to play house with the snooty neighbor girl, Margaret. Sometimes Dennis will temporarily get a pet or a new bicycle or make a new friend, but nothing will last forever. The status quo will be maintained, everything tied up in 25 minutes, like nothing ever happened. But then again, not only is this typical of situational comedies of this vintage, it's to be expected considering the show's equally frozen-in-time source material. For most of us Americans who have ever touched a newspaper, Dennis the Menace is, first and foremost, a comic strip created in 1951 by Hank Ketcham, which is still running today. You lot across the Atlantic got that other Dennis the Menace. Born in 1920, Hank Ketcham originally sought to break into the animation business. Dropping out of university a year in, Ketcham hitchhiked from Seattle, Washington to Los Angeles, California to try and get a job for Walt Disney. It took him a few years, but eventually he ended up as an in-between animator for Pinocchio, Bambi, Fantasia, and several Donald Duck shorts. He also crossed the picket line during the 1941 animator strike, which isn't super great. When World War II came knocking on the door, Ketcham was drafted and ended up as a photographic specialist for the U.S. Navy Reserve, as well as a cartoonist for the Navy War Bond Division, making posters and developing a Navy-themed comic strip called Half Hitch, as well as developing and writing 4 animated shorts starring a character named Mr. Hook. You know this kind of cartoon, the kind where only buying war bonds can stop the horribly racist Japanese caricature. After the war, Ketcham decided not to return to animation and instead focused on becoming a freelance cartoonist and starting his family, with his wife Alice and firstborn son Dennis. Ketcham had been playing around with the idea of a destructive, bratty kid for a while. A proto-Dennis the Menace comic strip called Little Joe was shopped around and ultimately rejected. Ketcham decided to tighten the focus into a single-panel gag comic, and he looked to his own life as a parent for inspiration. One October afternoon in 1950, I was at work in my tiny studio, finishing a drawing for the Saturday Evening Post when I was startled by a sudden outburst of mother noises coming from the bedroom area. Dennis was supposed to be taking a nap. Instead, he had spent the better part of 1 hour quietly dismantling his room. Bed, mattress, springs, dresser, drapes, and curtain rods. When the accidental load he carried in his underpants was added to his collection of plastic toys, cookie crumbs, and a leftover peanut butter sandwich, it formed an unusual mix, enough to drive an Irish mother to the brink. Now he was my son. Her rich expletives, most of them coined in Boston, were spliced with suggestions of abandonment and threats of bodily harm. After informing me that I could jolly well clean up his room, her parting shot was, "Your son is a menace." Dennis, a menace? I mused. So, much like A.A. Milne before him, Hank Ketcham commodified his own child as the main character of a multimedia juggernaut. And like A.A. Milne before him, this would eventually result in Ketcham and his son Dennis becoming estranged as adults. Dennis the Menace made his premiere as a one-panel gag comic on March 12, 1951, showing up in 16 newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune. It was an immediate hit, and by the end of the year could be found in hundreds of papers, including the 100 largest papers in the US. If you're familiar with the Dennis the Menace of today, the comic back then was pretty different. Instead of that chaotic but well-meaning little boy, the character of Dennis the Menace was much more actively a mean-spirited brat that would get into fights, pull pranks, and talk back to his parents. Caricatures of Hank and Alice Ketcham. However, as the comic became popular and reached a wider audience, the volume on Dennis's misdeeds were turned down ever so gradually. Dennis became less about getting into fights with the neighbor kids and more about bringing frogs into the house, playing his trumpet way too loud, and being way too truthful with the family's dinner guests. The tone and aesthetics and types of humor of the comic were adjusted to fit into the growing post-war family culture. For example, early in the comic's life, Henry and Alice Mitchell could be seen sharing a bed, but less than a year into its run, the parents were split into separate beds, as was traditional of couples on television and in movies of the time. Henry, Hank's own surrogate character, was originally characterized as more of a horn dog, much to his wife's anger, even going so far as to taking Dennis to a strip club. No, really, that happened. More adult humor like this was phased out of the comic, presumably to make the comic more marketable. And marketable it was. The first printed collection of Dennis the Menace comics in 1952 wound up on the New York Times bestseller list, and Hank Ketcham was soon approached to help develop a Dennis the Menace themed playground in Monterey, California, which would eventually open in 1956 and is still around to this day. The merchandise started to roll in: Dennis the Menace toys, Dennis the Menace children's clothing line, Dennis the Menace babysitter guides, contests where you submitted stories about your own children. And in 1954, Senator Ralph Flanders criticized Joseph McCarthy on a Senate floor speech, comparing him to both Hitler and Dennis the Menace. It's like if you said Mitch McConnell was as bad as Mussolini and Marmaduke. Point being, Dennis the Menace was mainstream in record time. A Dennis the Menace TV show was really a no-brainer. Once upon a time, media adaptations of comic strips were pretty common. The easy access to newspapers meant that these characters from the funny pages were well known to the general public, and most comic strips tended to be grounded comedies of human error or action-adventure stories. Easy to adapt and very welcome in the height of screwball comedies and adventure serials. For example, Blondie had a movie in 1938. Blondie had 28 movies beginning in 1938 and ending in 1950. 28 Blondie movies in 12 years. That's like 2 1/3 Blondie movies a year. Who was asking for 28 Blondie movies? Anyway, there were also a couple of Gasoline Alley movies. Little Lulu had a bunch of animated theatrical shorts. Little Orphan Annie had a very popular radio show. Popeye the Sailor was originally a comic strip character. Chester Gould's detective comic Dick Tracy became the first strip to get a dedicated TV show in 1950, followed by Terry and the Pirates in 1953, Flash Gordon in 1954, A Blondie Show in 1957, and Steve Canyon in 1958. Meanwhile, CBS had premiered a new sitcom in 1957 about an adorable, naive young boy named Beaver. However, Leave It to Beaver was initially a disappointment in the ratings, and CBS canceled the show after just one season. The show was then sold to ABC, and they managed to turn things around, not only getting better ratings than CBS had gotten, but managing to sell a great deal of Leave It to Beaver merchandise. Bummed that they hadn't gotten it to work, CBS started looking into possible shows to compete with the one they had created and given away, and a Dennis the Menace sitcom seemed like a perfect fit. It was produced by Screen Gems, the television subsidiary of Columbia Pictures, with Harry Ackerman, Leave It to Beaver's former executive producer, returning to produce its competition. The majority of the first season was written by the writing duo William Comley and Peggy Chandler, who had previously worked on The Eve Arden Show. As for casting, Herbert Anderson, who had been a reliable secondary actor in the romantic comedy scene, was cast as Father Henry Mitchell, while Gloria Henry, who had starred in a lot of movies about horse racing, oddly enough, and is actually still with us at the age of 96, was cast as wife Alice Mitchell. On top of looking exactly like their comic strip counterparts, they also formed the perfect image of the prototypical 50s sitcom parents.
I don't know whether I like the idea of Dennis trying to get a bike by himself.
I'm proud of him. He's showing initiative, thinking for himself, learning the value of $1. These are the things that build character.
I'm home. Well, I got myself a bike.
Where in the world did you get that?
It used to belong to Margaret Wade.
What do you mean used to?
Me and her got engaged.
Henry's father knows best, honey, what's for dinner demeanor, and the frequent presence of his pipe makes him seem like he's part of the Church of the Subgenius. Alice is the stay-at-home mother who is always cooking and doing chores around the house in dresses and heels. The place is spotless, Alice. Put on some sneakers and watch some TV, I beg you. Mr. Wilson was played by Joseph Kearns, who you may know as the voice of the doorknob in Disney's Alice in Wonderland.
I don't know what that Captain Blast has been telling you, but you will soon see for yourself that the moon is not made of green cheese, and that the man in the moon is just a figment of great Caesar's ghost. Oh, Dennis, get that silly balloon out of there.
It's quite all right. But you did give me quite a turn.
You see, I was following...
Rather good, what? Doorknob turn?
Please, sir.
Well, one good turn deserves another.
Visually, Kearns bears little resemblance to his comic strip counterpart, but more than makes up for it with his talents in comedic timing and just grade A mugging. Anderson and Henry could certainly pull faces, but Kearns is able to react to little boy hijinks as if a speeding train was coming right at him, and he's just done with the world.
Careful, Selby.
What place for Mr. Selby to be falling asleep?
Oh, Dennis, why must you always...
Wowee! Look at that, Dennis. Gee, Mr. Wilson, that's about the most different haircut I've ever seen.
Huh? Oh.
Rounding out the cast was Sylvia Field as Mrs. Wilson, Jeannie Russell as Margaret, and Billy Booth as Tommy. But of course, the key part to this whole operation was who they were going to get to play Dennis. Enter 8-year-old Jay North. Already a steady working child actor in small television parts and commercials, Jay North had been discovered after Screen Gems auditioned over 500 children. North's hair was bleached blonde, and he was instructed by the producers to claim he was a year younger than he actually was whenever talking to the press. The Dennis from the comics was perpetually 5.5-ish. That wasn't possible for the show, so this kind of marketing was used to make Dennis seem as young as possible and keep him young as long as possible. North is clearly a very talented child actor and gave the character of Dennis the right amount of adorable and grating. The kind of kid who screams into their mother's ear about how much they love her.
Mom, does Tommy and me have an apple?
Tommy and I.
Yeah, but how about me?
The character of Dennis the Menace had already shed a lot of the bratty attitude of the comics' early years, and the show reflected that. But even then, they found Dennis's destructive tendencies to be a bit much for television. In the first couple of episodes, Dennis was directly responsible for the destruction of furniture, fences. He even accidentally confused a construction crew into digging up a pool in Mr. Wilson's backyard.
Oh, there's a bomb crater in my backyard.
Bomb crater? That's the hole for your swimming pool.
What are you talking about? I don't have a swimming pool.
Sure you have, Mr. Wilson, and I helped dig it.
What? Oh!
Fun fact, the FDA approved the birth control pill 7 months after Dennis the Menace premiered. What a coincidence. Yes, this version of Dennis was still too much, so the writers toned him down even more. We softened the character of Dennis. In our show, he starts out trying to help someone and inadvertently gets into trouble. The menace comes from the conflict of the little boy facing the world and assuming grown-ups play by the same rules he uses. We're writing this series with honesty. Dennis isn't an out-and-out menace, he has good qualities. We wanted to do Dennis because it was a popular, very familiar going property, and we realized that certain changes would have to be made. Along with Tommy and Margaret, a number of largely anonymous children rotated regularly through Dennis's pool of friends. A couple of future big names showed up for an episode or two, including baby Kurt Russell and baby Ron Howard.
In one year I did about, maybe 4 or 5 Dennis the Menaces. I was kind of part of Jay North's gang there on that show. And, which was always fun to be around the other kids. I don't think I had very big parts. I don't remember feeling any particular, challenge with it or having to learn a lot of lines or anything. But what was really strange is that it was the first year of the show, and they were trying to get Jay's hair to do that thing, that that exists in the comic books where it's got like a giant tuft here that kind of comes back. And he used to be so miserable because they'd make him sit over in between shots with this kind of hairnet to try to form the hair, and then they'd spray it and stuff, and it was so annoying. And I just remember thinking, man, I'm glad nobody's doing that to me.
So with all that in place, Dennis the Menace filmed and aired its 32-episode first season and was an immediate success, becoming the 16th most watched show in 1959, beating out shows like Lassie, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and yes, Leave It to Beaver. Season 2 did even better, placing 11th, while Season 3 dropped to a still respectable 17th. The show had major sponsorships from Kellogg's and Best Foods, and sold a decent amount of merchandise of its own. Most notably, there was an attempt to turn Jay North into a child musical act singing Dennis the Menace themed songs.
Bet you can't guess where I am. Hello, Mr. Wilson. Hello, Mr. Wilson. Do you want to come out and play? Me and you could have a lot of fun. I got my bow and arrow and my gun. You could be an Indian on the run. Hello, Mr. Wilson. Hello, Mr. Wilson.
Dennis the Menace was a success. But was it good? Well, one thing I will say, if you want to learn how to write an incredibly tight half-hour sitcom script, study this show. Dennis the Menace is some of the tightest sitcom plotting I've ever encountered. Everything builds on each other. Every single detail either plays into an immediate gag or is part of the setup into a larger gag down the line. Nothing is wasted. To demonstrate, let's pick a random episode. Here's Season 1, Episode 7, The New Neighbors. Dennis comes over to Mr. Wilson's yard, who is spraying his flower garden. They get to talking about Mr. Wilson's flowers when a very loud 3-kid family leaves the house next door. The house's owner, Mr. Burnley, is trying to sell, and tells Mr. Wilson that if he could help Burnley find a buyer, there'd be a nice commission in it for him.
Look, if you can drum up a buyer for me, I'd gladly give you the 5% commission.
Burnley playfully gives the same offer to Dennis. During this conversation, Mr. Wilson says that Dennis's mother deserves flowers for putting up with her son every day. Dennis understands this to mean that it's okay to pick Mr. Wilson's flowers, so he grabs some and takes them home. Alice realizes that they're from Mr. Wilson's yard and calls him to apologize. During this phone conversation, Alice mentions a surprise party for one of their neighbors, but it turns out Mr. Wilson wasn't invited, and he's clearly put off by that. Meanwhile, Dennis took the term drum up a buyer quite literally, and has started marching up and down the street with his drum. This upsets Mr. Wilson's nap, so he chides Dennis and tells him to go home.
Wouldn't it be swell if somebody moved in that had kids for me and you to play with?
Now you probably think that Mr. Wilson breaking the window is just a gag, and it is. Ha, Mr. Wilson is so upset, he slammed the window and broke it. And for any other show, that would be the end of it. But no, Mr. Wilson breaking the window is a key plot point. The broken window means everything. Mrs. Wilson mentions that some of her friends, the Scotts, are apartment hunting, so Mr. Wilson suggests she bring them over to see the house. But to make sure Dennis doesn't ruin the sale, he gives the boy money to go to the movies with Tommy. Dennis goes to ask his mom if that's okay, where Dennis learns that his parents are going to the surprise party that evening. Dennis goes to Tommy's house, but learns they can't go to the movies after all. After his talk with Mom, however, Dennis has it in his head to throw a surprise party. So he and Tommy buy some ice cream with Mr. Wilson's money and start going around town, trying to find someone they can throw a surprise party for. The Scotts arrive at Mr. Wilson's house, as does Mr. Ferris, the window repairman, who gets to work within earshot of Mr. Wilson trying to sell the house. Dennis comes home.
Dennis Mitchell, have you been in Mr. Wilson's flowers again?
Heck no, Mom.
We'll see that you don't. Mr. Wilson is very unhappy today.
Just on account of those flowers I picked?
Well, not only that, he's also unhappy because he wasn't invited to the McClure surprise party.
Really? Boy, am I glad I came in to see you. See you later, Mom.
So Dennis decides to throw Mr. Wilson a surprise party, bringing in a bunch of screaming children and leaking ice cream into Wilson's house. The Scotts are turned off. They don't want to live in such a loud neighborhood. But you know who would like that house? Mr. Ferris. Yes, Mr. Wilson's pitch convinced the window repairman to buy the house. And guess what? Mr. Ferris has a lot of kids.
Sure glad he's gonna be living next door to you. 'Cause you like kids and we like you. Hey, Mr. Wilson, you broke your leg.
Every single detail builds to this conclusion. If Dennis hadn't picked those flowers, or if Mr. Burnley hadn't used the phrase drum up, or if Mr. Wilson hadn't broken the window, the story would have taken a completely different shape. Gags almost never exist for their own sake. If they can set up further gags and stories down the line, they will. The scripts in this show are finely tuned machines, every gear put there with purpose and function, and I'm honestly impressed with it. Which is not the same thing as saying that I found it all that funny. What comes into highlight quickly when marathoning Dennis the Menace for review is that it's all very samey. Dennis will misunderstand social cues in the exact same way every time. The parents of Mr. Wilson will respond to Dennis's antics the exact same way every time. Therefore, the comedy almost always fails to surprise. And yeah, this is very much the standard of sitcoms at the time, but the feeling I was left with, as a modern viewer, was that of very highly processed foods. Made with talent, sure, but the television equivalent of a plain piece of white bread. which is fitting for a show about 1950s upper-middle-class suburbia. Most of the plots here involve the Mitchell family dealing with the social trappings of the local community. Bake sales, country clubs, housewarming parties where everyone brings Jell-O with celery in it for some reason. The boss is coming over for dinner. It's all about keeping up social graces with the other moms on the block and the boys down at the office. And the show takes it all at face value. There is no satire of any kind here. Dennis isn't going around poking holes in how stupid the culture of homogenized, segregated, Protestant white suburbia is. He's just bringing a duck into the house. That's it. It should be noticed that Dennis the Menace's fourth season in 1962 did not place in the top 30 most watched shows. Instead, programming that played around with class or put the traditional sitcom into a new setting were gaining traction. Shows like the Beverly Hillbillies and the Flintstones. And the Addams Family was only a few years away to completely upend the kind of waspy lifestyle presented earnestly in this show. Another way the show dates itself horribly is how often Dennis the Menace is seen playing cowboys and Indians. This is inevitable, since the Western was as ubiquitous in the 1950s as superheroes are today. Cowboy toys sold, and that's the kind of thing kids were playing with. But there are plots where cowboys and Indians come front and center, and it can get very uncomfortable. The worst is the episode Dennis and the Cowboy, where a community pageant about an Indian raid is in rehearsals.
Now, Indians, start creeping toward the cabin. That's right. Creep. Cower, girls! All right. Creep, creep, creep. Now then, I'll start shooting. Bang!
The past was a mistake. It's not just that this stuff is dated in 2019, it was already dated in 1985. Now, the show did make one major change during its run, but for sad reasons. On February 17th, 1962, partway into filming season 3, after the show's 100th episode in fact, Joseph Kearns passed away unexpectedly from a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 55. It's believed that Kearns' Metrocal diet, a liquid protein fad, was a contributing factor. In the 1970s, the FDA tied Metrocal and similar products to over 50 deaths. The show would go on without him. Frequent Lucille Ball collaborator Gale Gordon was introduced as John Wilson, George Wilson's brother, taking over the house after George moved away, with Sarah Seeger as the new Mrs. Wilson.
It's going to be lots of fun Thursday, Mr. Wilson. Are you going to be there?
Dennis, I would rather be in the pot of a starving cannibal than in that courtroom. And I may also add that a court of law is no place for fun. Justice is a serious business, and you children should take advantage of your opportunity to learn something about the law and court procedure. Now, go and read your law books. I have work to do.
Mr. Wilson, I'm going to think about what you said.
That's fine, Dennis. You do that.
Have you ever been tried for murdering somebody?
Not recently, but don't press your luck.
Gale Gordon was fine. He certainly resembled the comic strip Mr. Wilson much more than Kearns did, but the show was certainly missing something without Kearns' mugging and energy. On top of that, Jay North was not getting any younger, and with the comic character staying perpetually 5 years old, CBS realized that they would have to close up shop before Dennis started going through puberty. The final episode of Dennis the Menace aired on July 7th, 1963. 4 seasons, 146 episodes in total, plenty for syndication. Speaking of syndication, let's get back to Nickelodeon.
He packs a shiny Ketcham. He's fast with a frog or a ball. When grown-ups get bossy and you need a posse, there's just one kid to call. Dennis the Menace, the hero of all kids.
Dennis the Menace, riding to your town, weekends on Nickelodeon.
In 1974, Screen Gems was rebranded as Columbia Pictures Television, while the distribution of old Screen Gems shows was handled by a company called Colex Enterprises, whom Nickelodeon purchased their initial set of Nick at Night shows from: Route 66, The Donna Reed Show, and Dennis the Menace. Again, having Dennis the Menace as Nick at Night's crossover show was a no-brainer. Not only was it a show starring a kid doing kid things, but the comic strip was still going strong 30 years on. Dennis the Menace became the official mascot of Dairy Queen in 1971, and an animated special, Dennis the Menace and Mayday for Mother, aired on televisions in 1981, and the franchise would continue to be relevant well after Nickelodeon's acquisition. A Dennis the Menace animated series would premiere in syndication in 1986. A live-action film, Dennis the Menace Dinosaur Hunter, went straight to video in 1987. And a theatrical film, simply titled Dennis the Menace, premiered in 1993. Fun fact, I participated in a test screening for that movie. It was certainly enough cultural relevance for the 59 Dennis the Menace to hold its spot in Nickelodeon for 9 whole years, finally getting pushed out for original programming in 1994. I can't say I watched Dennis the Menace a great deal as a kid. It felt antiquated in a way that Lassie didn't. There was just always something better on. Plus, again, there was a modern cartoon that I could go to instead. Still, it was a better fit for Nickelodeon than Hanging In was. But if you know anything about the Dennis the Menace show, you know there's an elephant in the room I've been avoiding up till now. We need to talk about Jay North, and if you missed the warning at the beginning of the video, this is gonna get a bit bleak. His story hadn't become public yet in 1985. If it had, there might have been hesitation in putting the show into Nickelodeon's lineup. Jay North got his start when his single mother, Dorothy, a secretary for the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, had pulled a favor to get her son into a local Los Angeles children's show, where he was noticed by a talent agent who got North's show business career started. When Dennis the Menace came into his life, North ended up making $500 an episode, over $4,000 when adjusted for inflation, a pretty hefty amount for a kid. His mother, however, insisted on not living off her child's salary and continued to work as a secretary during all of this. That meant she was too busy to be on set. So to keep an eye on her son, Dorothy's sister and her sister's husband, Mary and Hal Hooper, became North's on-set guardians. Now, producing a TV show can be stressful in the best of circumstances, especially for a kid. Long hours, on-site schooling, a lot of adults telling you what to do. But for Jay North, things were much, much worse, as the Hoopers were intensely physically, verbally, and emotionally abusive.
My aunt used a Svengali approach to me. She controlled me completely. I had no will of my own. All of my activities away from the camera were directed by her. It was almost like she would tell me, even when to go to the bathroom. And I always had to live up to her expectations. Nothing I did was ever good enough.
If I didn't live up to her unrealistic expectations, she would hit me, physically abuse me.
Physically strike me and spank me. My aunt would pull my hair and grab me and shake me and scream at me.
And the reason being?
And the reason being, Geraldo, was because that they wanted me to be a complete perfectionist. I had to do every take perfect, every take the way that they wanted it. And smile for everybody.
You better not take more than 2 takes and get it right. And if you take more than 2 takes, look out. They were just no-nonsense, humorless people.
I'd get in the car with my aunt and uncle, and they would start hitting me, and I'd be in the front seat. My aunt would hit me from one side, my uncle would hit me from the other, saying, you were terrible. And they'd criticize me verbally and physically for some imagined or insignificant fault in the day's shooting. And I was terrorized and brutalized for the entire 4 years of that show.
And I remember, I used to wake up every morning thinking, my God, do I have to spend another day with this woman? Because I would go in and I would do a scene, and I would come off the set and everybody would say, hey, you did a great job. And then I would get a slap across the face, or taken into the dressing room and get a spanking or a verbal tongue lashing or whatever. And she would just physically, she would grab my hair and, just shake me, and just made life a living hell for the whole 4 years. And my uncle was very abusive too.
Did you say, Mom, I hate this, I don't want to do this anymore?
Unfortunately, I never told my mom about the problems on the set, because my aunt and uncle threatened me with physical abuse if I revealed that to her.
So you have a young boy, already in a high-pressure show business situation, having to act cheerful every time he was out in public, but behind closed doors was receiving massive amounts of abuse. Feeling isolated, coerced into not telling anyone about this, Jay North turns inwards and started having dark thoughts.
I had a fascination with a science fiction film called The Village of the Damned, which was a science fiction classic about these blonde children who had this power where they could look at people and take control of their minds and make them do horrible things to themselves. And I wanted to do that to people. I wanted to hurt people. And I wanted to cause them the pain that they were causing me. I wanted revenge.
I fantasized about being one of these kids. I used to go home. I couldn't differentiate between reality and fantasy, Geraldo. I would go home on the weekends and stand in front of the mirror and practice focusing my eyes on the mirror, trying to get my eyes to glow like those kids, because I wanted to develop the power that those kids had. I wanted to walk on the soundstage on a Monday morning and make everybody kill themselves, a mass suicide. I just had murderous hatred and rage in me for those whole 4 years. It grew and grew and grew over a 20-year period.
When I would get my scripts, I used to draw on the back of my scripts, and I'd draw horrible pictures of people, especially like the production people, and I would have their names written down on the drawings. People in guillotines, people hanging, people on fire. Just horrible drawings of people being tortured and killed.
And how old were you?
I was 7, 8, 9. And nobody ever bothered to look in the script and look at these pictures and say, here is a child that is in real deep psychological trouble.
What she did as a child almost created a monster 30 years later.
After Dennis the Menace ran its course, Jay North tried to continue as a teen actor. And while he was in a couple of films in the 60s and one more very short-lived TV show, he quickly discovered that he had been too typecast as Dennis in order to find meaningful work.
All the pressure that I had was make people love you, make people enjoy you. And all of a sudden it wasn't there anymore.
Can you imagine finding yourself being a has-been at age 16 and 17?
Did people tell you you were a has-been?
Of course they did, Sally. I used to go into casting offices and people would say, you're finished in the business, get lost. I mean, when I was on the show, as I told you, my hair was bleached blonde for the show, for the role of Dennis the Menace. But my agent, after Dennis was over, said, get his hair back to being brown, because he will not work in this town with blonde hair. Everybody's going to see him as Dennis the Menace. But it was so tough after that, because here I was, this kid who gave pleasure to all these people, and it was like I said to myself, wait a minute, I worked and gave my heart to the studio, and now I've got to start all over again and prove to these people that I'm worthy, that I'm a competent actor, and I lost a lot of ambition after that.
As the jobs dried up, one thing North turned to in the 70s and 80s were television appearances making fun of his role in pop culture as the Dennis the Menace kid. But watching them in context, you can't help but sense North lashing out against how he was treated.
We caught up with Jay North, now 36 years old, walking Hollywood Boulevard in the city that made him famous. We talked with Jay in an exclusive, heartfelt one-on-one interview about the joys of being a child star and growing up in Hollywood.
Mr. North, I bet you carry with you a lot of fond memories.
They wouldn't hire me after Dennis. I've been burned once too often. Now it's their turn.
Mr. North!
Jay North was in a bad way through the 80s, dealing with depression and suicidal thoughts. And he wasn't the only one. A lot of child actors from the 50s and 60s were struggling around this time, most of them not being able to transition into an adult career. On January 18, 1990, Rusty Hammer, a former child star of the sitcom Make Room for Daddy, committed suicide at the age of 42. This motivated Paul Peterson, a former child actor famous for The Donna Reed Show, to begin A Minor Consideration, an advocacy group for the proper treatment of child actors. It was Paul Peterson that reached out to Jay North, got him involved with the program, and starting in 1990, North began to tell his story of abuse to the public. It was not an easy time, but North did have a couple of advantages. Unlike a lot of child stars, he was doing fine financially. His mother had wisely invested his Dennis the Menace money. With fresh encouragement, North went into therapy, and around the mid-90s, he was doing a lot better for himself. Nowadays, he lives in Florida, working in the Department of Corrections, maybe occasionally showing up at conventions to sign autographs. Despite all that happened, Jay North has survived. He shouldn't have had to fight to survive, though. Even if Dennis the Menace was the most amazing television show that ever existed, it wouldn't have been worth the abuse. The conditions that put North through hell are still very much possible. They didn't just belong to the 50s, but to the 70s and the 90s and now. And many children don't get through it unscathed. I think they are a terrible risk because we seem to have lost moral standards. Younger children are being exposed to things that they are not prepared to cope with. And if you are pushed by an ambitious set of parents and/or a management team, bad choices can be made, and the consequences of that, frankly, can be deadly. The first 4 months of this year certainly proved that, from Anna Nicole Smith to Britney Spears and Lindsay Lohan. Nicole Richie, how many lives do we need to see impacted negatively before we say, wait a second, we have got to get a handle on this? The 1990s was the time of A Minor Consideration, the time of Jay North telling a story. And it was also the time that Nickelodeon really picked up the production of child actor-led programming. There is a lot to consider when it comes to children in the entertainment industry. But the lesson learned from Dennis the Menace was to have careful consideration as to who would be taking care of these young people, who would be watching over them to make sure they were safe, that they not be taken advantage of, that they not be touched that way. And unfortunately, Nickelodeon didn't always succeed. Next time, Nickelodeon goes back to its roots with a comedy package show. But is there still a place for that in a post-Cy Schneider world? Today's research shout-out goes to The Merchant of Dennis the Menace by Hank Ketcham. Ketcham's autobiography, it actually has very little to say about the television version of the franchise, but if you're interested in the history of the comic strip, it's an interesting and very detailed read. Thank you all for watching, especially after that bummer of an ending. If you'd like to support Nick Knacks and other Pop Arena projects, consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to production values, research materials, and the odd box of Cheez-Its. You can also support the Pop Arena by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing to the channel, hitting that bell icon for notifications, following me on Twitter, sending a one-time donation through Ko-fi or PayPal, and sharing Nick Knacks with all your friends. See you on the flip side.